The battle had raged for hours. The alien forces were relentless in their pursuit, but Commander Kolora had held her ground, her blade slicing through the air with deadly precision as she fought her way through the enemy ranks. The battlefield was a mess of wrecked ships, twisted metal, and the bodies of fallen warriors from both sides. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. The ground was soaked in blood, yet Kolora pressed on with unwavering determination, her mind sharp and focused. She had never backed down from a fight, and today would be no different. But the ambush came without warning. Kolora heard the snap of a hidden trigger, and before she could react, the ground beneath her feet gave way and a blast of energy tore through her side. Her body was thrown violently to the ground. Pain surged through her as she struggled to rise, but the wound was too deep. Her vision blurred, and her breath came in ragged gasps. She reached for her communicator, but it was shattered from the blast. Only static responded to her frantic attempts. Kolora tried to push herself up, but her legs were too weak to carry her. She was slipping in and out of consciousness. The world around her seemed to spin as the sounds of the battle grew distant and muffled. Then she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone was approaching her. She barely had the strength to lift her head, but she could see the shadow of a figure looming over her. Someone was coming to finish the job. She prepared herself for the final blow. But the figure didn't strike. Instead, a voice broke through the haze of pain. "Stay down." The voice was rough, but there was a sense of calmness to it. Kolora tried to focus her blurred vision and saw him standing there, a human soldier dressed in combat gear. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat, and his eyes were sharp as he took in the sight of her injury. His hand hovered over his sidearm, but he didn't make any move to attack. Kalora's mind raced in disbelief. A human here on this alien world. She had never seen one this close before, and never expected to. She had heard the stories of human soldiers being fierce, but they were nothing compared to the might of her people. The Exceltor had always seen themselves as superior to all other species. The idea that a human would be the one to find her, let alone offer help, seemed impossible. But there he was staring down at her, without fear, without hesitation. "Why are you helping me?" She managed to rasp, her voice barely a whisper, her pride burning at the thought of needing help from a lesser species. "Because you're still breathing, and I don't leave people behind." The human's voice was steady as he knelt beside her, pulling her close to him and supporting her injured form as if it were nothing more than a simple task. His hands moved with practiced precision as he tore a piece of his own gear and wrapped it around her wound. Kolora tried to pull away her pride, pushing her to refuse help from this human, but her body betrayed her. She was too weak to resist. The blackness closing in around her vision, the warmth of his hands against her skin, felt strangely comforting. Despite everything, her anger faltered for just a moment. Kalora's body screamed in protest as the human lifted her carefully. His grip was firm and unwavering, but she could feel his strength was not infinite. Her weight was pulling him down. She wanted to argue, wanted to push him away, but the pain was too much. Her body felt like it was splitting in two, and she found herself unable to summon the strength to resist. He was dragging her across the battlefield toward the nearest cover, an abandoned wreck of a spaceship. The smoke from the nearby explosions stung her eyes and made her head swim. She could hear the distant rumble of enemy forces moving in the direction of their last position. They were closing in fast. Kalora's mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but the human was already moving faster than she could keep up. His hands were quick and sure as he found shelter within the wreck. She barely noticed how gently he lowered her to the ground. "Stay here," he said, his voice calm yet commanding. "I'll take care of your wounds and make sure they don't find us." Kolora had no choice but to comply as she lay there in the dirt, her thoughts spiraling out of control. The human had actually saved her. The thought gnawed at her. Her people were proud. They had never needed help from anyone, least of all from humans. But now here she was in the hands of one. His face was worn, but resolute. He had done what her own people had not been willing to do. He had saved her life, and now he was treating her as though she mattered. "You're human," she said, her voice hoarse as she struggled to make sense of the situation. "Why are you helping me?" The soldier paused for a moment, his hands still working on her wound. As he looked down at her, the expression in his eyes was unreadable, but there was something there that Kolora couldn't quite place. "Because that's what we do," he answered simply, his tone almost absent of emotion. We help people even if they're from another world." Kalora blinked in disbelief, her mind struggling to comprehend the implications of his words. Did humans really think like this, were they so different from the other species she had encountered? The thought was so alien to her that it left her speechless. "My people would have left me to die," she said before she could stop herself, her pride forcing the words out. "They would have seen me as weak, as a failure, not worth the effort to save." Weller didn't respond immediately. Instead, he finished bandaging her wound with quiet efficiency. Kalora could feel the warmth of his hands as they moved over her body, gently securing the makeshift dressing in place. She wanted to pull away, she wanted to lash out at him, but a strange sense of shame held her still for reasons she couldn't understand. "They're not all like that," he finally said, breaking the silence. "People can surprise you." Kalora's heart beat faster as the weight of his words sank, and she had spent her entire life believing in the superiority of her species, believing that no one else could match their strength and resolve. But this human had done something no one else had been willing to do. He had fought for her, even though she was nothing more than a wounded alien to him. For the first time in her life, Kalora found herself questioning everything she had believed and questioning the arrogance and pride that had defined her existence. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. Instead, she closed her eyes and let the silence linger between them. The hours stretched on as Kalora lay in the wreckage, her body aching and her mind racing. Despite the human's insistence on taking care of her, she couldn't shake the gnawing sense of betrayal that still burned inside her. She had been left behind by her own people, the very ones she had fought for, bled for, and led into battle. Yet here was this human, this soldier from a species she had once deemed weak, staying by her side, looking after her like she was someone worth saving. Weller was still at work, pulling items from his pack and setting up a crude shelter for the two of them. His focus was entirely on survival, his every action deliberate. It wasn't until the sun began to set, casting an eerie red glow over the battlefield, that he paused and looked down at her. "Think you'll be able to walk soon?" he asked, his voice calm, with a hint of humor. Kalora's lips curled into a half-smile, though the pain in her side made it difficult to form anything resembling a grin. "I've survived worse," she said, though she wasn't sure if she was convincing him or herself. "You'll need more than stubbornness to get through this," Weller said, his tone suddenly serious. "Your body's in bad shape. You push too hard, you might just bleed out before you make it anywhere." Her eyes flickered to his face, surprised at his bluntness. She had expected something more condescending, more patronizing. Instead, his words were matter of fact, grounded in his own experience. He wasn't here to placate her. He was here to ensure they both made it out alive. "You'll need to rely on me for a while," he continued, sitting beside her. "I'm not asking for your trust, but right now you need me, and I'm not going to let you die." Kalora met his gaze for the first time since she'd woken up. There was no hesitation in his eyes, no doubt, just the cold clarity of someone who had seen death up close and knew how to avoid it. She hated the fact that she couldn't argue with him, couldn't find the strength to deny the truth in his words. For all her pride, for all her years as a commander, she was vulnerable in this moment. The wound in her side was deep, and even her species-enhanced healing wouldn't be enough without immediate medical attention. For a long moment, she just stared at him. Her pride was still there, lurking in the back of her mind, urging her to fight back, to reject his help. But the exhaustion weighed her down, the bitter realization that her survival depended on this human soldier's care, and it finally broke through her walls. "Fine," she said, her voice tight with the effort of suppressing her anger. "You're right, I'm not going to survive this without your help." Weller gave her a small nod, as though he had expected nothing less. "We'll move out at first light," he said, his voice softening just a little. "I'll keep you safe, Kalora. You have my word." It was the first time he had used her name, and something about hearing it from him made her chest tighten. She was a warrior, a leader, someone who was always in control. Yet here she was, relying on this human soldier, someone she had never cared to understand, never considered important. And now his presence had become the only thing keeping her alive. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded. There was no room for pride anymore, only survival. The storm hit just as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. It came with brutal speed, the wind howling through the wrecked ships, sending debris flying, and the rain coming down in torrential sheets. Kalara had never seen anything like it. How the weather on this planet could shift so suddenly was beyond her understanding. She had hoped for a moment of respite, but the storm only worsened the already dire situation. Her body felt stiff, every movement pulling at her wounds, but there was no choice. The planet was far from safe, and staying here would only make them more vulnerable. Weller had already gathered their supplies, securing their meager rations and weapons. His eyes scanned the horizon, looking for a way out of the wreckage. He didn't seem fazed by the storm, moving quickly and efficiently despite the downpour, his focus always on their survival. For a moment, Kalara watched him from the shelter they had taken under the debris, a silent realization dawning in her mind. The human soldier was more than just a rescuer. He was a force of nature in his own right, just like her, calm under pressure, able to think clearly in the midst of chaos. "You ready to move?" Weller asked, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind as he crouched beside her. Kalara nodded, her pride still telling her not to show weakness, but the reality of her condition couldn't be ignored. The wound on her side was throbbing with each passing moment, her strength ebbing as the storm wore on. She pushed herself to her feet, testing her weight on her legs. The moment she stood, a sharp pain shot through her body, and she stumbled, barely catching herself on a nearby piece of metal. Weller was immediately there, his strong hands steadying her before she could fall. "Take it easy," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You're not going anywhere fast." Kalara grimaced, biting back the urge to lash out. The last thing she wanted was to be coddled or treated like she was incapable. She had led armies, commanded fleets, and faced enemies much worse than the storm in front of them. But now, as much as she hated to admit it, she needed help. "Lead the way," she grunted, her voice edged with frustration. Her pride was taking another blow, but there was no denying the truth. Weller wasn't just carrying her physically, he was carrying them both, emotionally and strategically. They moved as fast as they could, with Kalara leaning on him more than she cared to admit. The terrain was unforgiving, the jagged rocks slick with rain, and the ground beneath them a muddy mess. Every step Kalara took was a gamble, but she couldn't stop now. The enemy would be searching for them soon, and if they didn't find cover soon, they would be trapped. "Not much farther," Weller muttered, his face set in determination. He was always looking ahead, scanning for threats, as though he could sense the danger before it even arrived. It amazed Kalara how he remained so composed, even in such conditions. Suddenly, a distant roar cut through the storm, the ground vibrating beneath their feet. Kalara stiffened, her instincts immediately on high alert. "Predators," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. The sound of the creatures grew louder, closer, and Kalara could already hear the crunch of their massive claws against the wet earth. Weller's eyes narrowed, and without a word, he took her by the arm, guiding her through the rain-soaked jungle with newfound urgency. Kalara wanted to fight, wanted to stand and defend herself, but her strength was running out. She had no choice but to follow him as he expertly maneuvered them through the dense foliage. She could feel the weight of his steady presence beside her, guiding her through the storm. And then, as if by instinct, Weller dropped to the ground and pulled her into a narrow crevice between two large boulders. They were just in time. A massive scaled predator with glowing red eyes charged past, its hungry gaze sweeping the area. Kalara held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The creature's massive shadow passed so close she could feel the heat radiating off its body. She didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. Weller's hand rested on her shoulder, his touch reassuring but silent. They stayed hidden until the creature finally moved out of sight, but the danger wasn't over. The storm had brought a deadly new threat, and the human soldier, against all odds, had led her through it. For the first time since the battle, Kalara felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Trust. The storm raged on, but the immediate danger had passed. Kalara and Weller remained in the crevice for what felt like an eternity, the tension between them thick as they waited for the predator to move away. Every movement from the creature caused Colora's heart to race, the stillness of the moment heightening her senses. She could feel Weller's presence beside her, his breath steady, his body tense yet controlled. It was a stark contrast to her own racing thoughts, to the whirlwind of emotions and doubts that had taken hold of her. When the creature's roar faded into the distance, Weller made the first move. He gently tapped Colora's shoulder, signaling it was time to move. They emerged cautiously, the wet ground making every step treacherous. The predator was gone for now, but they both knew better than to think the danger was over. This world was full of creatures like that, lurking just beyond the edge of their vision. They continued through the jungle, with Colora leaning on Weller more than ever. Her wound had not healed, and the pain had only worsened in the cold, wet conditions. She was beginning to feel lightheaded, her energy reserves drained by the constant strain. The human's presence, once an uncomfortable necessity, was becoming a lifeline. He was steady, reliable in a way she had never expected from a member of a species she had always considered beneath her. "Are we close to the extraction point?" Colora asked, her voice hoarse and fatigued. She tried to sound commanding, to reclaim some of the authority she had lost in this strange situation, but there was no hiding the weakness in her words. "We'll be there soon," Weller answered, his eyes scanning the dense undergrowth for signs of danger. His voice was calm, unshaken by the threats around them. Colora couldn't help but notice how effortless he made it seem, how he moved with purpose through the chaos, unfazed by the peril that would have crippled others. She wasn't used to this, relying on another. Her entire life had been built around the idea that she was the one others relied on, the one who made the hard choices and led the charge. But now, in this alien jungle with a human by her side, Colera felt the vulnerability of her situation in a way she never had before. The reality of it clawed at her, the internal battle between her pride and the undeniable truth that Weller was the only reason she hadn't already succumbed to her wounds. As they moved, Colera glanced over at Weller. His face was streaked with dirt, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, but there was a calm determination about him. He wasn't just a soldier following orders. He was someone who had seen the worst of the universe and still held onto something that most others would have lost, a deep sense of duty. "What drives you?" she asked before she could stop herself. The question had been nagging at her for hours, the answer elusive yet essential. Why was he so determined to protect her, a warrior from an enemy species? Why had he gone out of his way to keep her alive? Weller looked over at her, his gaze steady. For a moment, he didn't answer. His lips pressed into a thin line as he considered the question. Then he spoke, his voice low but filled with conviction. "I don't leave people behind. That's all there is to it. It's not about who you are or where you come from. It's about what you do when it matters. When you have the chance to help, to make a difference, you take it. That's what keeps me going." Colora didn't know how to respond. She had spent her life believing in the superiority of her people, the Exceltor, and their might over every other species. She had led them through wars, through battles, with a belief that no one could match their strength. Yet here was this human, his convictions simple, yet profound, and it made her question everything. They continued on, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush. Colora's mind spun as she tried to make sense of this new reality. For the first time in her life, she was seeing the world through someone else's eyes, not as a conqueror, but as someone learning to trust, to rely on another. And as much as she hated the idea, she knew she was changing. Her world was shifting beneath her feet, and the human soldier beside her was at the center of it. The jungle around them had grown quieter, but the air still felt thick with the promise of danger. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, set Colora's nerves on edge. She was accustomed to the constant hum of battle, the noise of soldiers, the tension of an enemy nearby. But this was different. This was something primal, an unpredictable environment that didn't care about her rank or her history. It didn't care about who she was or how many battles she had fought. The jungle simply existed, indifferent to her survival. Weller, however, seemed unaffected by the silence. His eyes were always scanning, his body always moving with purpose. He knew the terrain, and he knew how to survive in it. He was a soldier, yes, but not in the way Kalora was used to. He wasn't driven by the thirst for victory or the need for dominance. He was driven by something else, something simpler, the will to survive and the commitment to protect those who couldn't do it alone. "We're close," Weller muttered, glancing over his shoulder. His voice was steady, but Kalora could see the weariness in his eyes. The storm had taken its toll on them both. "We just need to get past the ridge." Kalora nodded, though her strength was beginning to falter. Every step felt like a battle in itself, her body aching with exhaustion. The pain from her wound had become a constant companion, throbbing in time with her heartbeat. She was used to enduring pain, to pushing through it, but this was different. This wasn't the calculated agony of battle. This was a slow, creeping kind of suffering, a reminder that she was mortal, vulnerable. She glanced at Weller as they moved forward. His face was still set in that same calm determination, but she could see the strain in his posture. He was exhausted too, no doubt. Yet he didn't show it. Not once had he faltered in his resolve to get her to safety. Kalora wanted to ask him about himself, to learn more about the man who had saved her, who had become her only ally in this strange, hostile place. But her pride held her back. She didn't want to seem weak. She had been a commander, a leader for so long that the idea of revealing vulnerability, of seeking comfort from someone else, felt alien. "You've been through a lot," Weller said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "I can tell. You've seen war, seen death." He paused, his eyes narrowing, as if weighing his words. "It's hard, isn't it? Not just the battle itself, but the toll it takes, the weight it leaves behind." Kalora's breath caught in her throat. She had never expected him to speak so directly to her pain, to acknowledge the things she had kept buried for so long. She didn't know how to respond, so she said nothing. Weller didn't need an answer. He simply continued moving forward, guiding her over the rough terrain. They reached the ridge soon enough, though Kalora's legs were barely holding her up by then. She was grateful for his support, even if she didn't say it out loud. She had no choice but to lean into him, to accept his help despite the pride that burned in her chest. The moment they crested the ridge, the distant sound of engines hummed through the air. A faint hope bloomed in Kalora's chest. "Is that?" "Extraction," Weller said, his voice laced with relief. He quickened his pace, pulling her along as the sound of the engines grew louder. "We made it." Kalora's heart began to race, not with fear, but with something unfamiliar, gratitude. She had fought so hard to keep her independence, to remain the strong, unyielding warrior she had always been. But in this moment, she couldn't deny that without Weller's help, without his quiet strength and his unwavering determination, she wouldn't be here. As the extraction team came into view, Kalora allowed herself to finally breathe. The battle for survival wasn't over, but it had shifted in her mind. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't the leader, the commander, the one who held all the answers. She was simply someone who had been saved, and for the first time, she didn't feel ashamed of it. The extraction point was just ahead, but Kalora's legs felt like they were made of stone, heavy and unyielding. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt this way, so utterly spent, so fragile. The storm had passed, but the air was still thick with the humidity of the jungle, the scent of wet earth clinging to her clothes. Each step was a battle, and each step forward was a silent acknowledgement that she couldn't do this alone. Weller didn't falter. His movements were still steady, despite the fact that he, too, was weary. She could feel the weight of their journey in the set of his shoulders, in the way his jaw clenched as he focused on the horizon. He had been her constant, her rock, through it all. And now, as the extraction team's vehicles drew closer, the strange, conflicting emotions inside her surged once more. Relief mingled with an odd sense of loss, as though the end of this journey would mark the end of something else, something important. As they neared the extraction point, Kalora's mind began to race. What would happen next? She had been a commander, a leader of her people, the one who made decisions for the future. But now she was here, relying on a human to get her through, to help her survive. What did that make her? A weakling? A failure? The sound of engines grew louder, and Kalura could make out the silhouettes of the extraction team's vehicles cutting through the fog. But despite the imminent safety, her mind was still reeling from the revelations of the past hours. Weller had shown her a side of herself she wasn't prepared to confront, a side that didn't fit with the image she had of herself. She had always been the strong one, the one who led from the front, the one who never needed help. But now she had been forced to accept that strength wasn't just about standing alone. It was about knowing when to rely on others, when to trust. Weller glanced at her, his face a mix of concern and reassurance. "We're almost there," he said, his voice steady, but the quiet flicker of worry in his eyes was unmistakable. He had taken care of her without asking for anything in return, had kept her going even when she felt like she couldn't move another inch. And for the first time, Kalura realized that the soldier beside her was more than just a rescuer. He was her equal, not because of strength or rank, but because of his ability to act when it mattered most. "We made it this far," Kalura said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the exhaustion that threatened to pull her under. She looked at him, her gaze softer than it had been before. "I couldn't have done it without you, human." Weller's lips twitched in a smile, though it was more weary than triumphant. "Don't mention it. We're not out of the woods yet." Kalura wanted to respond, but her body had reached its limit. The adrenaline that had carried her this far was starting to wear off, and the pain from her wound was flaring again, burning through her side like a fire. She stumbled, her vision blurring at the edges, but before she could fall, Weller's arms shot out, catching her and pulling her upright. "Easy now," he said, his grip firm and unwavering. "I'm not letting you fall at the last moment." Kalura blinked, feeling a strange sense of gratitude well up inside her. It was an emotion she wasn't used to, and she wasn't sure how to handle it, but for now it didn't matter. The extraction team was close, the end of this harrowing journey was within reach, and she didn't have to face it alone. As they reached the edge of the extraction zone, Kalura could see the faces of the soldiers waiting for them. But her attention remained on Weller, the human who had become her unexpected savior. For all the war, all the bloodshed, all the battles she had fought, she had never imagined this. Never imagined that someone from a species she had once seen as beneath her would be the one to change her. "We're here," Weller said softly, and Kalura knew it wasn't just a statement about the extraction point. It was a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them, everything that had shifted irrevocably. The extraction team quickly surrounded them as they reached the clearing, the hum of their transport ships filling the air. Kalura could barely stand on her own anymore, her vision swimming, the last remnants of her strength flickering out like a dying star. But she was safe now. She could hear the shouts of her comrades, the familiar language of her people ringing in her ears. She had made it, thanks to Weller. Her legs nearly gave out beneath her, but before she could collapse, Weller was there, his arm supporting her. His grip was unshakable, his presence a quiet anchor that kept her grounded in the midst of the chaos. She hadn't realized until now how much she had come to rely on him. His strength wasn't just in his body or his resolve. It was in the way he held her, the way he never let go. A medic from her team rushed forward, taking Kalura from Weller's arms and immediately beginning to assess her injuries. Weller stepped back, looking over the group of soldiers now surrounding her. His eyes met hers one last time before he turned, stepping away from the fray as his work here was done. Kalura wanted to call out to him, to thank him properly, but the words stuck in her throat. There was no way to convey what she was feeling, not just gratitude, but a shift in everything she had believed. She didn't know how to say it, didn't know how to explain how much he had changed her. As the medic worked on her wound, Kalura glanced toward the retreating figure of Weller. His silhouette was already fading into the distance, swallowed by the bustle of the extraction. He didn't look back. There was no need for a hero's farewell, no dramatic speech. Weller didn't do things for glory. He did them because it was the right thing to do. "Is she going to make it, Doctor?" A familiar voice called out. Kalura turned her head slightly, recognizing the voice of one of her top officers. The officer's face was drawn with concern as he watched the medic work on her. "She'll be fine," the medic replied, though her tone was cautious. She's lucky she made it this far. The wound's deep, but nothing too critical. She needs rest and time to recover. Kalora closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to relax, to stop fighting for just a second. She was alive. She had made it. She had survived. And somehow, she owed that to a human soldier, a species she had once deemed inferior. The irony wasn't lost on her, and though she didn't understand it fully, she had to admit that the way she saw the universe had changed. Her pride, once an impenetrable wall, was slowly crumbling. The belief that strength came from standing alone was fading. The truth was, strength was about more than fighting battles and leading armies. It was about understanding when to stand firm and when to allow others to carry you. As the extraction ship's engines roared to life, lifting them off the ground, Kalora's gaze shifted toward the horizon. She had lived her life with a single purpose: to lead her people to greatness. But now, as she looked out at the unknown stars, she realized that greatness wasn't just about winning wars. It was about understanding, about connection. The ship's door slid closed, sealing her in with her comrades. But her thoughts were still with Weller, the human who had saved her, who had changed her. She wasn't the same as she had been when this journey began. She was different. She was no longer just a commander. She was someone who understood the true meaning of survival. And that, she realized, was a lesson worth more than any battle won.